Annenberg Media.
The economies of what was once the communist bloc, paying the price for decades of government economic planning and control. What changes will they have to make to join the global economy? Will changing more gradually make change less painful? Economies in transition. What will it take to make market systems work? We'll find out when we look inside the global economy.
Hello, this is Nariman Baravesh. In this segment of Inside the Global Economy, we're going to be talking about the economies in transition. These are the former communist countries that are making a transition to a capitalist or market-based system. And we'll ask the question, which of these countries has made a successful transition and which has not? And to answer those questions, we're going to look at two case studies, one in Russia, the other in Poland, and we'll also hear from a panel of experts. Now let's put things in perspective a little bit. In the early 1950s, two countries, Spain and Poland, had about the same standard of living. However, 40 years later, Spain's per capita income, its standard of living, was 4 times that of Poland's. What made the difference? Well, the difference was that Spain had successfully integrated itself into the global economy, into the rest of Europe. Whereas Poland, because of its communist system, had remained largely isolated from the rest of the world. Now, let's analyze a little bit more in depth the problems that face many of these communist countries in the old system, in the communist system. And let's first look at the microeconomic problems that faced many of these countries. First of all, prices did not reflect scarcity. In fact, prices were set by the government, and often the government intentionally distorted prices. For example, it kept prices very high on luxury consumer goods to discourage them, but kept prices quite low on investment goods to encourage investment. Second, investment and output levels were determined by the government. There was a large government bureaucracy that in effect decided exactly what was going to be produced and exactly how much of what was going to be produced. And as part of this, there were large government-owned enterprises. They were basically large monopolies that followed the dictates of the government. Third, physical capital and land were publicly owned. There was no private ownership. And this created some peculiar behavior. It reduced any incentives on the part of workers especially to cooperate, to feel any kind of ownership towards a company. And in fact, the joke was always said in terms of the employees' attitudes toward their employers, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. Finally, currencies were not convertible in these countries as well by government dictate. Namely, if you had rubles, you could not exchange them for dollars or for any other currency, even within the Soviet system. Now, these countries also faced macroeconomic problems. These are problems of the economy as a whole relating to policies. First of all, they had persistent budget deficits. This came about for 2 reasons. One is that the government subsidized a lot of consumption of basic goods, like food and like energy. So large amounts were paid to subsidize these products and keep their prices quite low. Basically, it was for a political reason to keep the people happy with the government. Second reason for budget deficits was that the state-owned enterprises ran large losses typically. Their expenses were much higher than their revenues. And they were allowed to continue losing money because the government basically picked up the tab. And this created a serious problem because these companies then were run inefficiently. There was no discipline. And so as a result of that, there was sort of a continual hemorrhage in terms of the government's need to keep helping out these companies, these large state-owned companies. Now, to finance these large budget deficits, we had stimulative monetary policy as well, which meant that in order to finance the deficit, the government, the central bank, kept printing money. And this combination of a stimulative fiscal policy, large budget deficits, and printing money created a lot of suppressed inflation, either long lines or in the currency markets, a depreciating currency. Let's spend a little bit of time on each of these. First of all, in a normal economy where prices functioned, as monetary policy is very stimulative and we're running these large budget deficits, the result is prices will rise very rapidly, and in some extreme cases, you can get hyperinflation. But in a Soviet-style system, in a centrally planned economy, prices were fixed. So how did this extra money, as it were, chasing around either the same number of goods or fewer goods, how did this manifest itself? Well, it manifested itself in terms of long lines. People had the money to pay for the goods, but there weren't more goods being produced. So in effect, increased demand showed up in terms of longer lines. Also in terms of the currency markets, obviously, officially, the exchange rate was fixed relative to other currencies. However, where it did show up was in the black market. And in fact, you could exchange, if you had dollars, you could exchange them at a very favorable exchange rate in, let's say, the former Soviet Union. You get a lot more rubles in the black market than you could at the official exchange rate. It was illegal, of course, but if you're willing to take the risk, then you could, in fact, get a very good exchange rate and make some money. Now, how did all of this impact the trade of these countries? To begin with, trade played the role of absorbing internal deficits and surpluses. What do we mean by this? Well, if you remember, this was a centrally planned system in which the government decided how much to produce and what to produce. But the government would often miss. It would produce too much or too little. So trade was a way of absorbing the surplus, basically, or filling the gap if there was a deficit. Second, the creation of Comecon led to big trade diversion and not much trade creation. Comecon was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, and it was the bloc, the trading bloc, formed by the communist countries. And the trade diversion occurred because it forced these countries to buy from the high-cost producers inside the bloc and divert their trade away from the low-cost producers outside the bloc. And as it turned out, there wasn't much trade creation within the bloc either. Third, specialization had to be planned for. Now remember, one of the great things about trade is it induces countries and companies to specialize and trade. However, if you've got a centrally planned system, then it's the central planning authority that has to make that decision. So for example, if Russia and Czechoslovakia wanted to get together and trade, they had to have the two central planning authorities get together and decide what each was going to specialize in and then trade. So it was not something that was just going to happen because the markets dictated it, but it had to be thought out and planned and worked out. And finally, multilateral trade was very difficult because, as we said earlier, by government decree, the currencies were non-convertible. They couldn't convert the currencies. So if you bought goods from one country and sold them to another country, you really couldn't exchange currencies. Just to give an example, if the Czechs sold trucks to Russia and got rubles, they couldn't then turn around and use those rubles to buy buses, let's say, from Poland. So this created huge problems, and it ended up that many of these countries got into bilateral agreements instead of multilateral agreements, which were often based on barter. A couple of embarrassing things that faced these countries were also that as they went into these bilateral agreements, they had to decide what the exchange was, even on a barter basis, or what the prices were that determined these exchanges. And since they had no internal prices of their own to guide them, they used Western prices, which obviously created a lot of embarrassment for them because they had to refer to the market system to give them guidance as to what to exchange. Another source of embarrassment was also that the world at large found the goods produced by these countries of very low quality. So by and large, they did not buy the goods produced by the communist system. Now, as we look at the post-communist transformation and the transition of these economies from a communist system to a market-based capitalist system, we can identify three distinct phases. In phase one, which lasts 1 to 5 years, we have the elimination of price controls and subsidies and the end of collectivism. This is the common public ownership of land and of companies and so forth. The second phase, which goes from maybe 3 years to 10 years, in this phase, the banking system is developed and small and medium-sized companies are privatized. They're sold off and become, in effect, private enterprises, much in the way we would recognize a company. And the third phase that can last, say, 5 to 15 or 20 years, in that phase, we have large-scale privatizations and the development of an entrepreneurial culture. Now, what's interesting is that different former communist countries fall into different phases here. Countries like Russia and the Ukraine are basically in phase 1, whereas other countries like Poland are much further along, closer to phase 3. To illustrate this point, let's look at our first case study that looks at privatization in Russia.
"600 kilometers to the east of Moscow on the Volga River lies the city of Nizhny Novgorod. The city was originally named after the Russian writer Gorky, who was born here. Heavy industrial concerns, such as the Gaz automobile factory, are located in and around Nizhny Novgorod. Due to its military production, it was for years a closed city for foreigners. Nizhny Novgorod has become well known both in Russia and outside because of its success with small-scale privatization. Just why was Nizhny Novgorod chosen for small-scale privatization? The Russian economist Grigory Yavlinsky.
Two main reasons. First of all, Nizhny Novgorod region is one of the most typical and in the same time is even harder for the reforms than the all other regions in Russia, because it was for a very long time, for dozens of years, it was a closed area, military area, and I had a feeling that if the people in such place like Nizhny Novgorod region would be able to start with a privatization, means that in any other region of Russia we would be able to move forward. The second reason was that I had a political trust to the politicians of this region, and I had a feeling that these people have a political will to do something. And then it became clear that it was not a mistake.
But how do you start a process of privatization in the centrally planned system? The question was put to Boris Nemtsov, governor of Nizhny Novgorod.
Most initiatives that took place before privatization depended on local civil servants. The local commerce was inadequate for the local bureaucrats. The first thing we did, even before privatization, was to get rid of the organizations that controlled trade. Additionally, we gave many shops the chance of opening bank accounts, and by doing so, to become private corporations. I found this program of commercializing trade to be extremely successful. State-run enterprises got freedom of trade.
One of the privatized corporations was the Pavlovo bus factory, producer of 11,000 buses each year. Of Pavlovo's 9,000 employees, 45% are women. What was the situation like before privatization? The factory director.
We worked under an administrative command system with all its shortcomings. The most important thing was that factory initiatives weren't supported by the state.
How did the employees view the privatization? We asked the director of the spray paint department.
When we gave them the choice of privatization, they said yes, because they would become owners of the factory. They would be free to set policy themselves.
In April 1992, every Russian received a voucher for 10,000 rubles, which could be used to buy shares in companies. What did the workers of this factory do with their vouchers?
I can't speak for all the workers, but I can tell you what I did with mine. I took my voucher and those of my wife, son and daughter and used them to buy shares in the factory.
Every worker at Pavlovo did that, exchanging the voucher for shares in their own company. How are the shares divided? The director.
Акции распределились следующим образом. 51%.
The shares were divided as follows. 51% belonged to the factory workers and pensioners.
Ушли на заслуженный отдых.
25% have been held in reserve and will be distributed by the Capital Growth
В
Committee.
резерве и будет распределяться
The other 24% were sold by auction in Nizhny Novgorod.
по имуществу.
Citizens of our district, as well as people from other regions in Russia, became
На
owners.
аукционах распроданы. Аукционы, которые проводились в Нижнем Новгороде. И обладателями наших акций стали жители нашей области и других регионов России.
Can you actually see a difference between before and after?
Да. Дело в том, что вот рабочие не почувствуют, что они становятся хозяинами.
Certainly, the workers really feel that they've become owners of the company, and they take an active role in improving working conditions, building living quarters, creche facilities, etc.
Что нужно строить дома, принимать, как бы сказать вам, принимать участие в строительстве жилых домов, постройке детсадов.
A wide variety of staff facilities were and still are available. A recreation building with a theatre. The factory has its own museum and an extensive sports complex. And the workers live in factory-provided homes. Does economist Yavlinsky think this is a successful form of privatization?
For the big privatization, we need strategy, which would start from demonopolization, then from separation the big factories from the social infrastructures, I mean housing, roads, water pools, medicine, hospitals, and so on, because up to date, today, enterprises are paying for that. 80% of their profit they're paying to subsidize, to support these places. And no one is going to invest. No one is going to buy any shares of these enterprises simply because there is no idea to pay 80% of your money for the things which are not needed.
In a short period of time, 2,000 businesses in Nizhny Novgorod have been privatized, and 3,000 new stores and cafes have opened. What does the governor think of the privatization?
Дело в том, что, к сожалению, в процессе приватизации...
Unfortunately, when it comes to privatization of large concerns, it's difficult to attract capital because of the country's reputed unstable legal system and high inflation. That's why the term privatization here means something totally different than what it does in the West, where it is connected with capital flows. In Russia, privatization is understood to mean separation from the state and civil servants.
What do economists think of the privatizations that were going on in Russia in the early 1990s? Some time ago, some of my economics colleagues and I got together in Melbourne, Australia, to discuss this case study. They include Hervé Torres of the International Monetary Fund, Magnus Blomström of the Stockholm School of Economics, and Rachel McCullough of Brandeis University in the U.S. Let's see how the discussion went.
Rachel, to understand the efficiencies or otherwise of a state-owned enterprise, perhaps historically we could look at how Russian companies operated.
It's important to keep in mind that under the old system, each company was part of a central plan, and that central plan specified the types and amounts of products that the firm would supply, the customers who would get those products, and also it specified where the firm would get every necessary purchased input to production. So that would include where it would get its machinery, where it would get its raw materials, where it would get any parts that were used in manufacturing its own products. One aspect of the central planning was that trade was to be minimized. Russia would have imported goods only to the extent that it could not produce them domestically at almost any cost. And occasionally when something failed in the central plan, an escape valve was to import a needed input or to import a needed output when some firm or other was unable to meet its agreed part of the plan.
So then in the transition, what was the important factor in terms of what's happened now? We've seen privatization. Is that enough? Hervé?
Privatizing the companies, meaning transferring the property, is not enough. You have to change the whole environment in which those enterprises have been operating. Usually, public enterprises have no competition. They do not have companies which got to compete. They don't have to be efficient. They can get all the money they need from the government. It doesn't matter whether they are producing with very high cost or not. They can translate all the cost to the consumers because usually they are monopolies. So in order to produce a really transformation of those economies, you have to privatize, but you have to set a new environment where competition, open markets, macroeconomic sound policies are established. You have to rely on a fiscal a strong position in which you are not giving money, all the money that the companies need, because this money creates a fiscal deficit, and that deficit creates inflation. So I would say privatization is necessary, but it's not sufficient.
The dislocation too, though, is a major issue in terms of the way it affects the people that have been working for the company. How can that be minimized?
Well, I think as an economist, the answer from our perspective is really let the markets function and function quickly, because one of the things that's happening in the former Soviet Union and the other Eastern European countries is that there is a burgeoning private sector of small companies that are getting set up. A lot of entrepreneurs setting up, many in the service sector. So many people who were dislocated, in fact, did go and find employment or start up companies on their own. So I think the answer, the simple, quick answer is let the markets function and function quickly.
And when we think about dislocations, it's probably not right to say how can we minimize the dislocations, because the dislocations are the other side of the vastly increased efficiency of most of these enterprises once they enter a market environment. So if a company is able to produce twice as much output with only half the staff, that's good, but the other side of it is that the resources that are released from that company must then find another productive use elsewhere in the economy.
But the political ramifications are so huge that that dislocation is enormously difficult politically. So what can a government do when it's trying to make that transition?
Well, the really central thing is to make the macro policies right so that new enterprises will be established. And without those, the resources released from the newly efficient old companies will never be reabsorbed.
Which is what we sort of picked up in those final comments. Thank you so much.
While some of the privatizations in Russia in the early 1990s, like the one we saw in the case study, were going relatively well, the bigger picture, the overall economy in Russia in the early 1990s was a lot bleaker. And in fact, both Russia and Ukraine were examples of countries where the transformation was going very badly during that time. Let's see if we can illustrate this by looking at some data. In both countries, we saw large declines in GDP, or gross domestic product, the output of the economy, in 1991, 1992, and 1993. In some years, we saw 15 to 20% declines in economic output, which is a depression by anybody's standard. Also, in both countries, inflation was raging. In Russia, it wasn't quite as bad. It was only about 20% a month in 1993. In Ukraine, in some months, it was higher than 50%, which by many definitions is hyperinflation. Now, the impact of this kind of inflation in Ukraine was a dramatic increase in their cost of living, which we can see on this graph. So that from early 1993 to the middle of 1994, the cost of living rose some 6,000%. Now, what was behind this? Well, basically, it was that the budget deficit in Ukraine got out of control. During this period, the Ukrainian government was spending a lot more than it was bringing in, and we can see that in these bar graphs. The yellow bars are total revenues coming into the Ukrainian government coffers, whereas the green bars are the spending of the government on a variety of things, including subsidies and so forth. And what we can see is that even though in 1992 the government had tried for a budget that only had a small deficit, the reality was spending got completely out of control and the deficit ballooned. Now, the government responded in two ways to this. First, it began to print a lot of money, which was one of the reasons behind the higher inflation. But it also put in place much higher taxes so that the top marginal tax rate in Ukraine during this period was 90%. And there were very high taxes on companies as well. And the combination of the higher taxes on individuals and the higher taxes on companies drove a lot of activity, a lot of economic activity underground. So what happened is that the underground economy grew fairly dramatically during this period. Now, the net effect of all of this on the currency in Ukraine was a dramatic depreciation in the currency, as we can see on this graph. The black market value of the coupon relative to the dollar fell from a very small amount to 50,000 coupons to the dollar. So one manifestation, at least in the marketplace, was a dramatic decline in the value of the currency. Now, to be fair, what was going on in Ukraine was somewhat unique. Before it split off from Russia in 1991, Ukraine had no banking system. It had no currency of its own. It had no structure. So it had to reinvent those, and in the process, it obviously ran into a lot of trouble, and one of the outcomes was this mismanaged process of transformation. Now, was the transformation process successful in other countries? To answer that, let's look at our second case study, which looks at Poland.
Linii gospodarczej Pollena w Nowym Dworze. Załoga specjalizuje się w produkcji popularnych mydeł Karat i Zefir oraz proszków do prania Bis, Pollena i Pollena Automat.
This chemical plant used to be owned by the state. In those days, more than 700 people worked in the factory. Today, it's privatized. Only half of the workforce is left, but production has more than doubled. Poland in the mid-80s, a part of communist Eastern Europe. The state controlled the economy. Polish consumers were forced to stand in queues outside shops. In 1990, it all changed. Communism was replaced by democracy and market reforms. The new liberal Polish government decreased public sector dramatically and started to privatize the state-owned companies. Another part of the new economic policy was the convertibility of the Polish currency. In a short time, the zloty was made convertible. This shock therapy changed the country into a market economy with foreign competition faster than any other country in Eastern Europe. In the beginning of the 90s, a number of modern shopping centers have opened in Warsaw. The competition on the consumer market has increased rapidly. Western imported goods compete on the shelves with products made in Poland. In this competition, a great part of the Polish industry had to shut down. To survive, former state companies had to go through dramatic changes.
Many of the people that used to work in our plant, they are already employed somewhere else. So then, let's say from about 700, we are down to, in the plant itself, probably half of this number.
Namoczyłaś, wyprałaś, rozwiesiłaś, w końcu prasujesz.
O nie!
I co teraz?
Będę musiała brać jeszcze raz.
Jeżeli choć raz musiałaś prać od nowa, wypróbuj Lance Color.
TV commercials was one important way to reach the consumers when the Polina factory was privatized and sold to the German multinational chemical company Benkisa. Meanwhile, the new company leadership had to automize the production line. With the old machinery, the factory couldn't survive on the new competitive market.
And we have big progress in washing powder production because now we have about 2 times higher capacity, and we started with production of liquid.
Do you think you work more effective today than you did before?
We are selling our product. Before we had a lot of trouble with selling our product, and for this reason we are of course much more effective. Our products are on the market.
Consequently, increased productivity is the reason why the factory has survived in the new competition. The dark side of increased productivity is unemployment. However, the ones who have kept their jobs in the factory have experienced the difference between state planning and market economy.
Przedtem też mi się dobrze pracowało. I teraz też. Może lepsze warunki są na pewno.
It was also a good job before, but I'm better paid now. We work harder. Often the factory is running 24 hours a day.
Jak potrzeba, to nieraz i trzecia jest zmiana.
Besides unemployment, there's another dark side of the market reforms: inflation. The rapidly increasing price and wage level has been a threat to the domestic industry. The only way for the government to keep Polish industry competitive is through continuous devaluations of the Polish currency. The decreased value of the zloty compared to foreign currencies has made Polish products cheaper compared to imported goods and saved many companies from going out of business.
At least in the last 2 years, both inflation and devaluation are fairly predictable. Devaluation is predictable because it's controlled by its so-called creeping devaluation with the maximum monthly rate of devaluation. And government stays very closely within that rate. Inflation, at least in current year and the previous year, the central bank was able to predict inflation fairly closely. So once again, if you can predict both of them, inflation and devaluation, you can cope with them.
Today, Benkisa is making good profit in Poland. The company has 20% of the national market share and is increasing production. Much of the profit is put into research and development at the plant outside Warsaw. Poland is, among economists around the world, seen as an example of how it is possible to change a command economy into a market economy in short time. The Polish example has been seen as a way of changing other former state-planned economies in Eastern Europe. Today, queues no longer exist outside shops in Warsaw. For Polish consumers, the lack of goods is no longer the problem. The problem, as in other capitalist countries, is to have enough money to buy the products available in the shops.
Why do economists believe that the transition in Poland was more successful than the transition in Russia or Ukraine? Let's go back to Melbourne, Australia, and hear from our panel of experts.
Well, Magnus, if the move to a market economy is such a good one, why is it so painful, this process?
Well, simply because the old system was such a bad system. And the new system, the market economy, is such a superior system to the old one. And what we have seen here in the case of Poland is mainly that products has become cheaper and definitely much better, and that's a positive side of the change. But we didn't see very much about the negative side of it, namely that it creates unemployment and maybe inflation. On the other hand, one can say that unemployment is it's freeing of resources. I mean, we have the tendency to look at it as a very bad thing. On the other hand, you know, a lot of people now get free to do things that they are better, that they should have done instead of these bad things before.
But that process is still painful. 50% of the workers in the Polish factory lost their jobs.
Yes, but then the government has a big role to play here, to create an environment, to create economic policy that makes it much easier for these people to get a job.
I think that about the painfulness of going to a market economy, it has to be said that not going to it can be even more painful. And that's the point. Sometimes people say, well, why privatize this company? Half of the employees are going to be laid off. Well, what happens is the company remains in the hands of the government. At the end, it won't be half percent. It will be 100%, because the company is not going to be able to, to sustain such a large number of people. So adjustment and reforming is painful, but it is more painful not to do it.
What do you do in the transition phase, though, when prices are going up, people's incomes are going down, consumers are badly affected?
Well, I think we would all agree that we're not saying that there is no role for the government to play in terms of easing the pain, but it has to be done in such a way that it doesn't interfere with the adjustment process. So in that sense, what you don't want to do is you don't want to slow down the adjustment process, but you clearly, I mean, there is a role, you don't want people starving on the streets and so forth, so the government has a role to play there, but it's in terms of perhaps income subsidies rather than trying to get in the way of the price mechanism, giving the signals to a company that it should, in fact, lay off 50% of its workers and improve productivity in the process and its efficiency. And I think that's where we come out.
What about the existence, then, say, of a black market that's existed in many of these East European countries, the former Soviet Union? How do you replace that at the same time?
Well, black market can actually be a very positive element in an economy like this because it can generate jobs, it can generate businesses, and it can be a very dynamic element. There's nothing wrong with a black economy or a black market in a country like this.
Mm.
Usually the black market is the real market.
That's right.
And it's been operating all along.
Yeah.
So if we're going to judge this transition, is cold turkey the way to go, or do we need a slower, more gradual transition process?
Well, that's a decision that really depends crucially on the form of the political system. If we look at China, which is perhaps the most important example of a country that's taken the gradual route, that's a country that does not have a democratic government. And so it's controlled from the top in a dictatorial way. Although the economy has decentralized, it really hasn't moved in one step to a market as is being attempted in a number of other countries. Where you have a democratically elected system, or even a larger voice for the people, even without all the trappings of democracy, then it becomes much more difficult to do things in a gradual way, because the government today may be elected out tomorrow, and it's better to get all the reforms in and let them take their effect as speedily as possible.
But another interesting case is Vietnam. Northern Vietnam has a longer tradition of centrally planned economy than southern Vietnam. What happens now when they liberalize? Well, southern Vietnam, out of more or less the same day as they were liberalized, immediately began to produce and very soon export their product, their rice in that case. So I think, and in most developing countries, at least we have had a black market, but also market economies to a large extent, although it has been screwed up by government policy.
Even within the Eastern European and former Soviet bloc countries, those like Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic that had some experience with a price mechanism with markets, or in the case of Hungary, that actually had some markets that function with price signals, are much further along this process of adjustment than those like the Ukraine and Russia that really have had almost no experience with markets and price. Yeah.
So then in that case, when you're talking about coming from such a far point, is cold turkey the only way? It makes transition processes almost redundant because the political unsaleability of that is going to be impossible. Certainly
the experience in Russia suggests that is the way it should proceed. If you contrast the Russian experience, let's say, with the Polish experience, although they're different, and one has to be careful in comparing the two, but just looking at them, suggests that the Polish method of cold turkey is the better way to approach it, rather than keep delaying and delaying and delaying and postponing.
Mm. And again, though, I guess we should come back to then what, if we try and put it as clearly as possible, what is the transition process if you're going from state-owned to market economy? Do you have to go the privatization route? Trevor?
You mean the timing and sequencing of the reforms? Well, certainly the timing and the sequencing of the reforms is important. For example, you can't or you shouldn't go to a trade liberalization if you are not having a fiscal policy which is a sound policy, or a monetary policy which is a sound monetary policy. You should try to move as quickly as possible in a comprehensive manner in the different areas, so that, for example, let me give you another example. If you are trying to compete, or if you want your companies to compete abroad, you have provided them with some changes in your regulatory market so that they really have the capacity or the flexibility to do it. In some cases, in some countries, some reform have not taken place or took place too late, and then it finished the whole reform. Monetary reform, fiscal reform, labor reform, market labor reform are tremendously important, and in some cases those reforms haven't taken place.
Heber, thank you.
So what made the transition in Poland as successful as it was, let's say, compared to Russia and Ukraine? We can illustrate that by looking at some data on Poland during this period, during the early 1990s. To begin with, as the government, as the central bureaucracy, was dismantled, and as price controls were taken off, as the government pulled out of trying to control the economy, prices exploded. Basically, there was a lot of pent-up demand for goods, and as the controls came off, prices just took off. And we see that inflation in 1990 was 600%. However, immediately after that, the government clamped down on credit, it tightened monetary policy, and the result was a dramatic decline in the inflation rate, so that by 1993, it was well within the double-digit rates. So the secret here was that the government tightened credit, unlike Russia and Ukraine that kept printing money. The results of that were fairly predictable in the sense that initially the economy declined very dramatically. It fell about 12% in 1990. However, soon after that, it began to bounce back, and by 1993, growth was close to 4%. So in fact, the adjustment was a sharp but short one, and even at its worst, the decline in output in Poland was much less than the decline in output in either Russia or Ukraine. What about some of the other impacts? Well, clearly, when you get this kind of a contraction, unemployment goes up. So the unemployment rate rose to about 16% by 1994. But while this graph doesn't show it, in the middle of 1994, the unemployment rate stabilized and actually began to come down a little bit. But nonetheless, this is the downside of a transition process to a market economy. And clearly, part of what happens is, in order for the private sector in Poland to become more productive, the workforce had to shrink, basically. And this is what was going on here. Also, as a result of trade barriers being removed, remember, part of the communist system was to isolate countries from the rest of the world economically. As trade barriers were removed, the floodgates opened up. There was a big pent-up demand for imported goods, imported Western goods. So they flooded in. So we saw a ballooning of the trade deficit in Poland in 91, 92, and 93. And this had the predictable result of bringing about a depreciation in the value of the Polish zloty, their currency. So we see a dramatic depreciation here for two reasons. Initially, it was because of the very high inflation rates in Poland. But after that was brought under control, if you remember from the previous graph, the trade deficit ballooned, and that was later the reason behind the depreciation of the zloty in 1993 and 1994. Now let's look at a sub-theme that was going on here, and a very important one. if you look at the overall performance of the economy, it actually tended to look bleaker than if you looked at the subcomponents. An example of this is employment. Notice that total employment declined about 20% from 1990 to 1993, whereas employment in private businesses rose some 80% during the same period. What was going on? Well, the total employment picture was being greatly influenced by the fact that Poland was dismantling its large public enterprises. It was privatizing them, it was pulling them apart, and so a lot of people were getting laid off as a result of that. However, at the same time, the market reforms that Poland had put together made the environment for the creation of new businesses very favorable. So in fact, a lot of small businesses in the retail sector, in the services sector, and so forth were getting set up, and obviously these new companies were creating jobs. And that's what's behind this very dramatic and vibrant increase in employment in the private sector. So if you looked at the total picture, it looked kind of bleak. But if you just went below the surface and said, okay, what's really going on here? There were some very interesting changes going on and some very dynamic, exciting improvements going on in Poland at the same time. So the government and the policies in Poland were correct in the sense that they did create the environment for the creation of a market economy. We've seen examples of transitions that were successful and transitions that were not successful. Let's see if we can pull this together and look at the ingredients for success. And there are a number of them. First of all, this notion of a hard budget constraint. Remember, we talked about that in the old communist system, there was something called a soft budget constraint. This allowed the big state-owned enterprises to keep losing money. In other words, they were not being disciplined in any way. So they kept losing money. There was no consequence for them losing money because basically the government picked up the tab. With a hard budget constraint, essentially what's being done is these companies are being cut loose and essentially said, fend for yourselves. So then the budgets matter. It matters if you're losing money. So that is a critical element in the transition process and a very important element in the transition process. The second is price liberalization. This means removing price controls, letting the free market determine what happens to prices. And again, in the experience of Poland, we saw initially prices rose very dramatically, but eventually with a proper monetary policy, they came down again. Now, there's a debate about, is it good to do this price liberalization quickly, as Poland did? This is sometimes referred to as shock therapy or shock treatment, or to do it gradually, as Ukraine and Russia did. And clearly, the success in Poland suggests that the shock therapy, the fast approach to price liberalization, seems to be the better one. Third, wage discipline. Part of the inflation control policies in a country like Poland include wage discipline. And the way Poland did this was it imposed a tax on those companies that paid wages above its guidelines. So, for example, if Poland was, the government suggested guidelines of 20% increases in wages, but a company paid 30% increases in wages to its employees, then it had to pay a tax on that additional 10% increase in wages that it gave away. So that was a way of controlling the increase in wages in Poland. Fourth, cuts in government subsidies. If you remember, in the old communist system, one of the drags on government spending were the big subsidies that were paid for things like food and coal and energy. So by eliminating those, I mean, clearly it hurt people who depended on them, but it also reduced the big budget deficits that Poland and some of the other countries had. Fifth, meaningful privatization. This had two aspects to it. One, the dismantling of the old, large, monopolistic state-owned enterprises to make them more efficient, to make them smaller, in some instances to get rid of them, but also the creation of an environment in which the new development and the gestation of new companies was possible. So it had both elements. One, to sell off the big state-owned enterprises, the other to create the environment where capitalism basically could flourish. And finally, full currency convertibility. So in the case of Poland, the zloty could be converted freely into other currencies. This was crucial because what it allowed was the signals from the world market in terms of world prices to influence the domestic economy. This helped Poland to become more integrated into the global economy, more integrated into the European economy. And in fact, if you look at Poland's export performance from 1990 to 1993, you see that Poland's exports to Europe were about 44% of its total exports in 1990 and rose to 63% in 1993. So in that sense, Poland became more integrated into Europe, more integrated into the rest of the world. Now, not everybody obviously benefits or benefited in the early 1990s from these transitions. A number of groups got hurt. Who got hurt? To begin with, the unemployed, obviously. We saw in the graphs earlier that the unemployment rate went up to 16% in Poland by 1994, and this included people in the inefficient industries in Poland, like textiles or electronics or the defense industries. On the other hand, there were other groups, highly educated people, who had an easy time getting jobs. So it very much depended on the background and the industry you were in. Another group that got hurt were the state employees. Again, some of it having to do with privatization as the large state-owned enterprises were being dismantled, but also the state sector in Poland was huge, and as that was shrinking in the process of this transition, a number of people obviously lost their jobs. Third, welfare recipients. The communist system gave very generous pensions, and pensions to older people in Poland accounted for some 15% of GDP, the gross domestic product in Poland. So clearly, this had to shrink and did shrink a little bit in the process. So the welfare recipients also were hurt. Finally, farmers were hurt. And it's interesting here, the Polish farmers were a large part of the population. They made up 30% of the population before the transition process, but they only accounted for 8% of GDP. That tells you that they were extremely unproductive farmers, so it was no surprise that they were going to get hurt. And clearly, the positive side of these negatives of the hurt is that in order for an economy to make a transition, a transformation, in order for it to become more efficient, to become more productive, to become integrated into the global economy, there has to be some pain. There has to be some unemployment. There has to be some shifting of resources away from inefficient sectors to efficient sectors. Clearly, one of the roles of the government is to help that transition, to help those people who are unemployed move to other industries where there is now a comparative advantage. So there is a difficult political reality that a lot of these countries have had to face, and that is that with the gain comes some pain. So there can't be gain without pain. The pain typically shows up in higher unemployment. But any attempt to slow down that process only lengthens the pain. It doesn't remove it. It doesn't eliminate it. So there will be pain because there was a lot of distortions, a lot of inefficiencies in the old communist governments. But in order to change that, in order to move to capitalism, there have to be some painful adjustments. And that is just part of the process. But obviously, politically, it's a very difficult thing to swallow. Now, how can the West help out in this process? Well, there's a basic thing that the West can do, and that is provide trade, not aid. What do I mean by that? The best thing, the best gift, if you will, that the West can give these transitioning economies in transformation and transition, is to leave its market open for the goods from those countries, whether it's textiles or steel or what have you, agricultural products. It's to allow these markets and these countries to play to their comparative advantage. So that is the best thing that the government can do. Aid serves a purpose in the near term, perhaps to help with some of the adjustments. However, in the long run, aid tends to be wasted or squandered and can tend to have counterproductive kinds of results. So the best result is, as these economies are integrating into the global economy, for the West to leave the doors open for their goods. So what's the bottom line? Well, the bottom line is the quicker that the former centrally planned economies can integrate into the global economy, the faster their standard of living will rise. Now, what the transitioning economies themselves can do is to speed up the process of transformation. What the Western economies can do is to leave their doors open to trade from these economies. For Inside the Global Economy, this is Nariman Baravesh.
Annenberg Media. For information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.